She had dried baby spit up on her collar, $12 in her checking account, and exactly 3 minutes to corner the CEO of the city's most ruthless acquisitions firm. If she failed, she and her son were on the street. Pride was dead. Begging was all she had left. The marble floor of the Blake & Partners building was so polished it looked wet. Claire stared down at it, watching the reflection of her scuffed faux leather pumps. The left heel was wearing down at an angle. It made her ankle ache. She had been sitting in the lobby for 3 hours. The security guard, a thick-necked guy smelling faintly of stale spearmint and boredom, had already told her twice that Artan Blake didn't take unscheduled meetings. Claire had simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and remained in the rigid, low-slung designer chair that offered zero lumbar support. Her son, Leo, was at a subsidized daycare across town. He had a fever this morning, just 99 degrees, but enough to make his eyes glassy and his breathing sound like crushed dry leaves. She had left him anyway. She hated herself for it, a deep, gnawing rot in her stomach. But rent was due in 4 days. The eviction notice was folded into a tight, sharp-edged square in her cheap canvas tote bag. At 11:14 a.m., the elevator banks chimed. A soft, melodic ping that commanded the vast expanse of the lobby. Artan Blake stepped out. He didn't look like the master of the universe the financial magazines painted him as. He looked exhausted. He was a tall man, early 50s, with thinning gray hair and a jawline that seemed permanently clamped in irritation. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Claire had earned in the last 3 years. But he wore it aggressively, like armor he was tired of carrying. He was flanked by 2 aides, both walking half a step behind him, clutching tablets. Claire stood up. Her legs were numb from sitting so long. Pins and needles shot up her calves, making her stumble on the first step. She didn't have a speech. She didn't have a pitch. She just moved. She cut across the lobby, ignoring the sudden sharp shout of the security guard. She practically threw herself into Blake's path, stopping just short of a physical collision. "Mr. Blake!" Her voice cracked. It sounded thin, reedy, pathetic. Blake stopped. The 2 aides bumped into each other behind him. He looked down at her. Up close, he smelled of expensive vetiver, dry-cleaned wool, and cold espresso. His eyes were a flat, pale blue. They didn't hold surprise, only a dull, heavy annoyance. "Security is right behind you," Blake said. His voice was gravelly, quiet. He didn't even raise it. "I need a job," Claire said. The words tasted like ash. She felt the heat creeping up her neck, the horrible, humiliating flush of a grown woman stripping away her dignity in public. "Any job. Data entry, filing, cleaning the break room. I know you're migrating the legacy files for the telecom merger. I know you're behind schedule." Blake blinked, a slow, deliberate movement. The aide to his left, a young man with too much hair gel, leaned in. "Sir, I'll handle this." "How do you know about the migration?" Blake interrupted, his gaze fixed on Claire. "Because your firm fired the independent contractors last week," Claire lied. She had read a rumor on a finance message board at 2 a.m. while holding a damp washcloth to Leo's forehead. "You thought you could do it in-house. You can't. The data architecture is from 2012. It's a mess. Your analysts think they're too good for manual line-item reconciliation." The security guard's heavy hand clamped down on Claire's shoulder. His grip was bruising. "All right, lady, let's go." "I'll do it for minimum wage," Claire blurted out, her voice rising in pitch, panic finally piercing the numbness. She dug her heels into the slick marble, resisting the guard's pull. "I'll work nights. I'll work 70 hours a week. Just give me 30 days, 1 month. If I don't clear the backlog, you don't even have to pay me." Blake stared at her. He took in the frayed edges of her coat, the desperate, hollowed-out look in her eyes, the dried stain on her collar. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was calculating. He was a man who looked at the world as a series of depreciating assets and hostile takeovers. Right now, he was looking at human desperation and pricing it. "Let her go, Tom," Blake said softly to the guard. The heavy hand vanished from Claire's shoulder. She swayed slightly, suddenly unmoored. 30 days, Blake said. "You're in the basement archives. No windows. You're reconciling 10 years of paper receipts into the new system. It is miserable, mindless work. You make one error that makes it to my desk. You're gone." "Thank you," Claire whispered, her knees suddenly feeling like water. "Don't thank me," Blake muttered, already stepping around her. "Talk to HR on the 4th floor. Tell them you're the new temp. 30 days. He walked away, the glass revolving doors swallowing him and his entourage. Claire stood alone in the center of the lobby, the cold air conditioning freezing the sweat on her back. She closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. It wasn't a victory. It was a stay of execution. The basement of Blake and Partners smelled faintly of ozone, old paper, and industrial bleach. There were no hushed wool carpets down here, only cracked linoleum tiles that hissed under the rolling wheels of Claire's chair. Her desk was a battered laminate folding table pressed against a concrete wall. Her tools consisted of a dual-monitor setup that cast a harsh, blinding white glare across her face, and 12 cardboard banker's boxes stacked like a fortress around her. Day 1 through day 14 blurred into a suffocating tunnel of exhaustion. Her alarm went off at 4 a.m. every day in her apartment. The apartment was a damp, single-bedroom box over a 24-hour laundromat. The constant thrum of the commercial washing machines below vibrated through the floorboards, making the cheap cutlery in her kitchen drawer rattle. She would wake up, ignoring the dull throb in her lower back, and check on Leo. She'd press her lips to his forehead to check his temperature, inhaling the scent of his slightly sweaty, sleep-mussed hair. That smell, warm, innocent, milky, was the only thing that kept her from walking into the nearest river. By 6 a.m., she was on the bus. By 7 a.m., she was in the basement. The work was excruciating. It wasn't just data entry. It was deciphering the chaotic, handwritten, and poorly documented financial history of a telecom company Blake was trying to gut and sell. She had to cross-reference faded taxi receipts from 2014 against digital expense ledgers that frequently crashed. Her eyes burned constantly. She developed a permanent tight knot at the base of her skull. She survived on the free acidic drip coffee from the break room 2 floors up, stealing handfuls of sugar packets to stave off the mid-afternoon crashes. She didn't eat lunch. She couldn't afford to buy it, and she didn't have the time to pack it. Sometimes, if there was a catered meeting on the 4th floor, she would wait until the executives left and scavenge half-eaten bagel halves or leftover fruit slices, wrapping them in paper towels and shoving them into her pockets. It was humiliating, scraping the bottom of the corporate barrel, but the fear of the eviction notice kept her fingers flying across the keyboard. She rarely saw Artan Blake. When she did, it was a fleeting, terrifying collision. On day 12, she was carrying a stack of missorted files to the elevator bank when the doors opened, revealing Blake and a man she recognized vaguely from the financial pages. A senior partner. Claire stepped back, eyes downcast, trying to blend into the frosted glass of the hallway wall. The discrepancies in the 2018 capital expenditures are unacceptable, Blake was saying, his voice sharp, echoing in the narrow corridor. If the auditors see this, the valuation drops by 20%. We're looking into it, Artan, the partner said, sounding defensive. The files are a labyrinth. Claire didn't mean to speak. It was a reflex, born of sleep deprivation and the sheer obsessive intimacy she had developed with the files over the last 2 weeks. It's not a discrepancy, Claire said. Both men stopped. They looked at her as if a piece of the office furniture had suddenly started speaking. Blake frowned, his pale eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" Blake said. Claire swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry. The 2018 CapEx. It looks like a discrepancy because the telecom firm categorized their server maintenance under operational expenses in Q1 and Q2, but then switched it to capital expenditures in Q3 to artificially inflate their EBITDA before a failed funding round. You just have to reverse the reclassification in the ledger. It zeroes out. Silence stretched in the hallway. The partner looked at Claire, then at Blake, a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. Blake didn't look at the partner. He stared at Claire. His gaze was heavy, analytical. He wasn't looking at the frayed cuffs of her sweater anymore. He was looking at her eyes. "What is your name?" Blake asked. "Claire Jenkins. I'm the temp in the archives." "Have you corrected the ledger, Claire Jenkins?" "I'm halfway through Q4 of 2018 now. I'll have it reconciled by tomorrow morning." Blake held her gaze for a second longer, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "See that you do." He walked past her. He didn't offer praise. He didn't smile. But as the elevator doors closed, Claire felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. She had made herself visible. In a place like Blake and Partners, visibility was dangerous. Her hands shook as she walked back to the basement. She sat in the harsh glare of her monitors, the cursor blinking mercilessly. She shouldn't have known about the EBITDA manipulation. A temp doing mindless data entry wouldn't have spotted that. An executive would. A CFO would. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until bursts of color exploded in the darkness. She was getting sloppy. The exhaustion was eroding the walls she had spent 3 years building. She needed the money. She needed to survive the 30 days. But if she drew too much attention, the background check would be expedited. HR was already sending her automated emails about a mismatch in her Social Security verification. She had used her real SSN. To fake one would be a federal crime she couldn't risk. But she had applied under the name Jenkins, her ex-husband's name, a name she hadn't legally used in years, not since the divorce, not since she tried to burn her old life to the ground. If HR manually pulled her file, if they ran a deep trace on the SSN, they wouldn't find Claire Jenkins, desperate single mother. They would find Claire Gallagher, and Artan Blake despised the Gallaghers more than anyone else on Earth. By day 22, the atmosphere in the building shifted. The quiet, humming tension of the pending merger escalated into an all-out frantic war. The board of directors descended. They were a collection of older men and sharp-eyed women who moved through the hallways like sharks in shallow water. The executives on the upper floors were sweating, barking orders, and firing junior analysts for minor infractions. Even the basement wasn't safe. Claire felt the pressure physically. Her shoulders ached constantly, a dull, throbbing pain that radiated down her arms. She was eating ibuprofen like candy. Her apartment was falling into disrepair. dishes piled in the sink, laundry overflowing, because she was working 16-hour days. Leo was acting out at daycare, crying when she dropped him off, clinging to her leg with a desperate strength that broke her heart every single morning. Just 8 more days, she told herself, staring at the blurred numbers on her screen. If I make it to 30 days, the probation ends. The health insurance kicks in. I get the signing bonus. The bonus was $10,000. To the men upstairs, it was pocket change. To Claire, it was salvation. It was 6 months of rent. It was an inhaler for Leo that she didn't have to ration. It was the ability to breathe. On day 25, the whispers started. She went up to the 4th floor to grab coffee. The break room was sleek, with a stainless steel espresso machine and bowls of organic fruit. As she poured the harsh drip coffee into her paper cup, she heard 2 HR associates talking in the adjacent hallway. "I'm telling you, the system keeps kicking it back," one voice said, hushed but annoyed. "The SSN is valid, but the name doesn't match the Federal Registry. It flagged it for a manual fraud review." "Just run it," the second voice replied. "The board wants everyone vetted before the data room opens to the buyers. Pierce is throwing a fit about security protocols. Just pull the full hard pull report. We'll have the results in a few days." Claire's hand froze mid-pour. The black coffee overflowed the paper cup, spilling scalding hot over her knuckles. She bit her lip to stifle a gasp, quickly dropping the pot and grabbing a handful of coarse brown paper towels. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A violent, panicked rhythm. Pierce. Gregory Pierce. He was the chairman of the board. He was also the man who, along with Artan Blake, had orchestrated the hostile boardroom coup that ousted her father, Richard Gallagher, from the very firm he had founded. Blake and Partners used to be Gallagher and Blake. Her father had been a brilliant, vicious man. He had built the firm from nothing, but his arrogance, his reckless leveraging, and his undeniable cruelty had alienated everyone. Artan Blake, his protege, had finally stabbed him in the front, rallying the board to vote Richard out to save the company from bankruptcy. The fallout had destroyed her father. It had destroyed her family. Claire, who had been a rising star in a rival firm at the time, had her own career collateral damage from her father's toxic radioactive blast radius. She had dropped her maiden name, married a man who turned out to be a mistake, and tried to disappear. If Gregory Pierce saw her face, if he looked closely enough at the exhausted, hollowed-out woman in the basement, he would recognize her. She had her father's chin. She had his dark, heavy-lidded eyes. She used to sit at the country club dinners with Pierce when she was a teenager, listening to him laugh at her father's jokes. She fled the break room, her hand throbbing from the burn, leaving a puddle of coffee on the granite counter. Back in the basement, she couldn't focus. The numbers swam. The white glare of the monitors felt like an interrogation spotlight. Day 26, day 27. She worked like a machine, trying to outrun the inevitable. She finished the 2018 reconciliation. She started on 2019. Her accuracy rate was 99.8%. She was doing the work of 3 senior analysts, fueled by nothing but terror and stale bagels. On day 28, Artan Blake came down to the basement. He didn't send an aide. He didn't call. He just appeared in the doorway of the archive room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in the fluorescent-lit bunker. Claire froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Blake walked slowly toward her desk. He looked at the towering stacks of cardboard boxes, all perfectly aligned, marked with thick black Sharpie. He looked at the dual monitors, displaying dense, perfectly formatted pivot tables. Then he looked at her. "You finished the entire legacy migration," Blake said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of disbelief. "I have 2 quarters left in 2019, Claire said, her voice tight. She kept her hands on the desk so he wouldn't see them tremble. "I will finish them tonight." Blake pulled up a folding metal chair and sat across from her. The proximity was suffocating. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. "The analysts on the 6th floor said it would take 6 weeks, Blake said quietly. "They said the data was too fragmented, too corrupted." "They were lazy," Claire said, the cynicism slipping out before she could catch it. "They rely on automated scrapers. You can't scrape scanned PDFs from 10 years ago. You have to read them. You have to understand the context of the spend." Blake watched her. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the faint hum of the servers down the hall. "Who are you, Claire?" he asked. The question hit her like a physical blow. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "I'm your temp," she said. "I'm the woman who begged you for a job." "People who beg for jobs in lobbies don't know how to reconstruct a corrupted EBITDA model," Blake countered. "They don't know how to spot reclassification fraud. You work like someone who has been trained in a top-tier firm. But your resume says you've been working retail and admin for 5 years. "I read a lot," Claire lied, her voice flat. Blake let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "You're lying to me." "Does it matter?" Claire asked, desperation making her reckless. She leaned forward, mirroring his posture. "Does it matter who I am? I did the work. I saved your merger timeline. You owe me my 30 days. You owe me the contract." Blake stood up slowly. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't owe anyone anything. The board is reviewing all finalized vendor and employee contracts tomorrow morning. Day 29. He turned and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "If HR clears your paperwork," Blake said, looking over his shoulder, "you have a permanent position on the 4th floor. If they find out you've been lying, you'll be escorted out by security, and I'll withhold your pay for breach of contract." The door clicked shut. Claire sat in the silence, the cold dread settling deep into her bones. Tomorrow was day 29. The HR manual review would be on Gregory Pierce's desk. The ghost of Richard Gallagher was about to walk into the boardroom, and she was going to lose everything. The morning of day 29 tasted like copper. Claire had slept for exactly 80 minutes, slumped forward on her desk with her cheek pressed against the hard plastic edge of her keyboard. When she woke, her spine felt fused together. A thin line of drool had dried on her chin. She scrubbed her face with her palms, her skin feeling greasy and papery at the same time. The final quarter of 2019 was done. The legacy files were no longer a chaotic graveyard of corrupted PDFs and handwritten receipts. They were a streamlined, heavily fortified data architecture. She had found a staggering $2 million in misallocated funds, effectively saving the valuation of the merger. She hit save on the master ledger. The server hummed, the little loading wheel spinning on her monitor. It felt anticlimactic. There were no fireworks, no applause, just the faint smell of industrial bleach from the hallway and the throbbing ache behind her eyes. At 9:15 a.m., the basement door opened. It wasn't Artan Blake this time. It was a young woman from HR, wearing a crisp beige-sheathed dress and holding a manila folder tight against her chest. She looked around the basement as if she had just stepped into a biohazard zone. "Claire Jenkins?" the woman asked. Her voice was thin, nervous. "Yes." "Mr. Pierce and the board are requesting your presence in Conference Room A, on the 42nd floor." Claire's stomach bottomed out. A cold, heavy stone dropped straight into her pelvis. She looked at the woman's manicured nails gripping the edge of the folder. It wasn't the thin folder of a standard employee review. It was thick. "Okay," Claire said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her. She stood up. Her faux leather pumps felt too loose on her feet. She didn't bother grabbing her bag or her coat. If this was the end, she wouldn't need them. She followed the HR woman to the executive elevator. The ride-up took 40 seconds. Claire watched the digital floor indicator climb. 12, 24, 36. Her ears popped. The silence in the elevator car was dense, suffocating. She focused on the reflection of her face in the polished steel doors. The dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises. Her hair, pulled back into a severe clip, had strays sticking out at odd angles. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been ground down to the bone. The doors slid open. The 42nd floor was another world. The carpet was thick, silencing their footsteps instantly. The walls were paneled in rich, dark walnut. The air smelled of expensive, masculine cologne and ozone from the massive copying machines down the hall. Conference Room A had double-glass doors. Inside, 12 people sat around a massive slab of white marble that served as a table. Artan Blake sat near the middle, his expression perfectly blank. At the head of the table sat Gregory Pierce. He was older than Claire remembered, his face deeply lined. His silver hair swept back immaculately. He wore a gray suit with a subtle pinstripe. As Claire walked in, the low murmur of conversation instantly died. The HR woman hovered near the door. "Claire Jenkins, gentlemen." Pierce leaned back in his leather chair. It creaked softly. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply stared at her, his dark eyes moving over her wrinkled collar, her scuffed shoes, and finally settling on her face. A slow, cruel recognition bloomed in his expression. "Jenkins," Pierce said. He rolled the name around in his mouth like it was spoiled wine. "That was the husband's name, wasn't it? The one who filed for bankruptcy right before the divorce?" Claire felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, prickly wave of humiliation. She clamped her jaw shut. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a flinch. Pierce tossed the thick manila folder onto the center of the marble table. It landed with a heavy thwack. "We ran the manual fraud alert on the Social Security mismatch," Pierce said, addressing the room but keeping his eyes locked on Claire. "It turns out our miraculous temp down in the basement isn't just an overqualified clerk. Gentlemen, meet Claire Gallagher, Richard Gallagher's daughter." A murmur rippled through the boardroom. Several of the older men shifted uncomfortably. A woman to Pierce's right frowned, looking at Claire as if she were carrying a contagious disease. Artan Blake didn't move. He kept his hands steepled in front of his face, watching the exchange with the cold detachment of a scientist observing an insect under glass. "I see the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to fraud," Pierce continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your father manipulated our books to hide his catastrophic leverage. You manipulated federal verification systems just to get into the building. What was the plan, Claire? Corporate espionage? Steal the merger data to sell to a competitor? Or just plain old sabotage to avenge dear old Dad?" I didn't fake the Social Security number, Claire said. Her voice was raspy from disuse, but it carried in the quiet room. I just used my legal married name. I didn't break any laws. You lied by omission on a federal financial employment form, Pierce snapped, leaning forward. That is grounds for immediate termination and potentially a civil suit. We are in the middle of a delicate multi-billion-dollar acquisition. We cannot have a Gallagher anywhere near our data room. I am the only reason your data room exists, Claire fired back. The words ripped out of her before she could stop them. The polite, subservient mask she had worn for 28 days shattered. The sheer injustice of it, the late nights, the terror of eviction, the smell of Leo's fever, boiled over into a white-hot rage. She took a step closer to the marble table, planting her hands on the cold surface. Your analysts are incompetent, Claire said, her voice shaking now, raw and loud. They couldn't reconcile the 2018 capital expenditures because they didn't want to read the raw files. You have $2 million in operational expenses masquerading as CapEx. If your auditors found that, they would have tanked your valuation by 20%. I fixed it. I built the pivot tables. I zeroed out the ledger. She glared at Pierce, her chest heaving. I don't care about my father. I haven't spoken to him in 6 years. I don't care about your boardroom politics. I care about my paycheck. I did the work. You owe me the signing bonus. Pierce laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. We owe you nothing, he said softly. You breached contract the second you walked through the doors under false pretenses. You are a liability. HR is drafting your termination papers right now. You will be escorted off the premises by security. You will not receive a dime. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. The room tilted slightly. No. She needed that money. Rent was past due. The eviction was imminent. Arton, Claire said, turning desperately to Blake. You said if I cleared the backlog. I said if HR cleared your paperwork, Blake interrupted. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes flat and unreadable. They didn't. Claire stared at him. The betrayal wasn't hot. It was freezing cold. He had known. When he came down to the basement yesterday, he had known exactly who she was. He had just wanted her to finish the final quarter of data before he threw her to the wolves. You used me, she whispered. I utilized an available resource, Blake corrected calmly. Pierce waved a hand dismissively. Security is waiting in the hall. Get her out of here. Claire didn't argue. She didn't cry. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, echoing exhaustion. She pushed herself away from the marble table. She didn't look back at Blake or Pierce. She turned and walked out the glass doors, her scuffed heels sinking into the plush carpet, the silence of the 42nd floor swallowing her whole. The eviction notice was taped to the outside of her apartment door when she got home. Bright neon green paper. It clashed horribly with the peeling brown paint of the hallway. Claire peeled it off slowly, the adhesive tearing with a sharp ripping sound. She walked inside. The apartment smelled of old grease from the exhaust vent of the laundromat downstairs and the faint sweet scent of Leo's baby shampoo. She had exactly 36 hours to vacate. Leo was sitting on the threadbare rug in the living room, pushing a plastic fire truck back and forth. His fever had broken completely. He looked up at her, his dark eyes. Her father's eyes, wide and bright. Mama home early, he announced. Yeah, baby, Claire whispered. Her throat felt like it was packed with sand. Mama's home. She sank onto the couch, the cheap springs groaning under her weight. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had a safety net. She just sat there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, trying to figure out how she was going to pack their lives into garbage bags in which women's shelter had beds available on a Tuesday night. She spent the evening in a fugue state. She made boxed macaroni and cheese, measuring out the milk carefully because they were almost out. She bathed Leo, the warm water soaking into her cuffs. She put him to bed, singing a lullaby with a voice that felt entirely disconnected from her body. Then she sat in the dark living room, the green eviction notice sitting on the cheap veneer coffee table like a glowing radioactive isotope. Morning came, day 30, the day her contract was supposed to end, the day the $10,000 bonus was supposed to hit her checking account. She woke up to a heavy rhythmic thumping. It wasn't the washing machines downstairs. It was a knock on her apartment door. Claire frowned, sitting up on the couch where she had fallen asleep. She checked her phone. It was 6:30 a.m. She padded to the door in her sock, sliding the cheap brass chain into the lock before cracking it open. Artam Blake stood in the dim, flickering fluorescent light of the hallway. He looked entirely out of place. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat over a tailored suit. He didn't flinch at the smell of the hallway, nor did he look at the peeling paint. He looked directly at Claire through the 2-inch gap in the door. "You look terrible," Blake said. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. "What do you want?" Claire asked, her voice raspy with sleep and hostility. "Come to watch the eviction in person?" "Open the door, Claire." "No, I'll call the cops. It's trespassing." "You're past due on your phone bill," Blake said mildly. "It was shut off at midnight. Open the door. I have a contract for you to sign." Claire froze. Her hand tightened on the brass chain. Slowly, cautiously, she slid the chain off and opened the door wider. Blake stepped inside. The apartment was cramped, but he didn't shrink into it. He commanded the space immediately. He walked over to the coffee table, his polished shoes loud against the cheap laminate flooring. He saw the green eviction notice. He didn't comment on it. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his overcoat and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope. He dropped it on top of the neon green paper. "What is this?" Claire asked, wrapping her arms around her chest. The apartment was drafty. "It's a cashier's check for $25,000, Blake said. "Your signing bonus, plus the back pay for the overtime HR tried to scrub from the system, and a new contract." Claire stared at the envelope. Her heart gave a sudden violent lurch against her ribs. She didn't reach for it. She had survived 30 years by learning that nothing in this world was free, especially not from men like him. "Why?" she asked, her voice hard. "Yesterday, you let Pierce throw me out like trash." "Yesterday, Pierce needed to feel like he was in control," Blake said. He unbuttoned his overcoat, looking around the bleak apartment with analytical detachment. "Pierce is an idiot. He's a dinosaur who cares more about old grudges than actual data. But he is still the chairman of the board. If I had defended you yesterday, he would have called for a vote of no confidence against me." Blake turned back to her, his pale eyes intense in the low light. "You found the $2 million discrepancy in the 2019 CapEx," Blake said softly. "But you didn't just fix it, Claire. You documented exactly who authorized the reclassification. You left the digital paper trail intact before you zeroed it out." Claire swallowed hard. "The authorization codes traced back to Pierce's personal executive assistant. Pierce ordered the books cooked to keep the valuation artificially high so he could cash out his stock options." "Exactly," Blake said. A ghost of a smile razor-thin and utterly devoid of warmth, touched his lips. When you left the boardroom, I let Pierce gloat. Then I handed the board your documentation. Pierce was quietly forced into early retirement at 10 p.m. last night. The board elected me as the new chairman an hour later. Claire stared at him. The sheer, calculated ruthlessness of it took her breath away. He hadn't used her to fix the data. He had used her as a human landmine, waiting for Pierce to step on it. "You knew," Claire said, the realization settling like ice in her veins. "You knew Pierce was cooking the books. You brought me out of the basement because you knew I would find it, and you knew Pierce would try to fire me, making himself look vindictive and defensive right before you dropped the evidence." "I told you on day one," Blake said, his voice flat. "I do not tolerate errors. Pierce made an error. You did not." He gestured to the envelope on the table. "The new contract makes you the lead forensic auditor for the acquisitions team. Your office is on the 41st floor. It has a window. You report directly to me. Your starting salary is $200,000 a year." Claire looked at the envelope. It was the end of the fear. It was a new apartment. It was a good school for Leo. It was breathing room. But as she looked back up at Artan Blake, she realized the truth. The basement was a prison, but the 41st floor was a battlefield. She was trading one kind of survival for another. She was stepping back into the exact same shark tank that had chewed up her father. Only this time, she was swimming with a man who had orchestrated the blood in the water. "You're a monster," Claire said quietly. "I'm a CEO," Blake corrected. "And you, Claire, are a Gallagher. You have the same vicious streak your father had. But unlike him, you've learned how to bleed without crying. That makes you dangerous." He walked past her, heading for the door. "Be in my office by 9, Blake said, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Don't wear those scuffed shoes. You represent the firm now." The door clicked shut behind him. Claire stood alone in the dim apartment. From the bedroom, she heard the soft rustle of Leo turning over in his sleep. She walked slowly to the coffee table. She picked up the cream-colored envelope. It felt heavy in her hands. She opened it, pulling out the cashier's check. $25,000. The zeros blurred together. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply folded the check carefully into her pocket, picked up the neon green eviction notice, and ripped it into tiny, jagged pieces, dropping them into the trash. The 30 days were over. The real work was just beginning. Did Claire make the right choice stepping back into the shark tank, or did she just sell her soul for survival? Let us know in the comments below. If you felt every agonizing second of Claire's 30-day grind, smash that like button and share this story with anyone who knows the true meaning of the hustle. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more grounded, emotional stories about power, survival, and corporate warfare